The aircraft carriers of the Japanese Navy are a popular topic, from the massive Akagi and Kaga to the smaller Hiryu or Zui Kaku. These are the ships that rampage through the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, the legendary Kido Butai. However, as with all things, these ships had to start somewhere decidedly more modest. And for the Japanese, that meant the quaint little Hōshō, a very small aircraft carrier of the early 1920s, one of two contenders for first purpose-built aircraft carrier alongside HMS Hermes. That particular argument goes something like, do you go for laid down first or completed first? Hōshō is an interesting case regardless. She's one of very few Japanese carriers to survive the Pacific War, and would outlive both Hermes and her nearest American equivalent, Langley. Granted, this is mostly because she was kept close to home for 99% of the conflict. But I digress. Before we get into that part of the story, we really do need to start with the design process. While not quite as much of a mess as Hermes in this regard, Hōshō did go through several stages, with different sources giving different tellings of the story on top of that issue. Either way, let's get into it now. It's generally accepted that this story began in 1918. The Japanese Navy wanted a seaplane carrier to go along with fleet expansion plans. Understandable, because they'd had notable success using Wakamiya off China in 1914. Where things get a bit touchy is how Hōshō started her life. Older sources will cite the ship originating as an auxiliary named Hiryu. Both warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Conway go this route, though even here with some differences. Warships cites Hiryu being laid down in December 1919 and intended as a tanker. Conway opts for the ship being a specialized transport, while noting that some sources will suggest she was going to be a tanker. A more recent article in Warship 2008 cites this as partially correct. Hōshō began as one of 6 special ships ordered in the 8-6 fleet program. The other 5 were completed as tankers, but that doesn't necessarily mean Hōshō was going to be the same. This confusion isn't surprising, Japanese records being what they are. Regardless, once Hōshō was set to be a seaplane carrier, her design process could begin, with this following something of a winding path toward completion. Initially, the ship would have been something like HMS Campania, a flying off deck on the bow with a more traditional superstructure, probably without Campania's unique funnel arrangement. This would be short-lived, however. The Japanese were allied with the British at the time, and that meant observers in the Royal Navy, who were quite enamored with the midpoint of HMS Furious's refits, the landing and flight deck with superstructure in the middle stage, or if you prefer, the "you want us to land on that" stage. This would also be short-lived, about the time the Japanese redesigned Hōshō to be similar to a smaller Furious, aft landing deck, forward flight deck, a midship superstructure. More reports arrived. This time, it would be HMS Argus influencing the situation. The first truly flush-deck aircraft carrier, albeit one converted from an ocean liner. This would see the final redesign of Hōshō to a full-length flight deck in April of 1919. With this design in hand, construction could finally begin. Hōshō was laid down on December 16, 1920. Or if you use warships, this came in December of 1919. Either way, it is still after Hermes. However, the Japanese would finish their ships sooner. Hōshō was launched on November 13, 1921, and commissioned on December 27, 1922, with the following design, at least as built: a displacement of 7,470 tons at the standard loading, with a heavier 9,500 or so tons at the normal load. This tonnage came from a hull of 168 meters, 552 feet in length, with a beam of 18 meters, 59 feet. And with a full-length flight deck, it was the same 168 meters long, but 22 meters, 74 feet wide. With that deck supported by a small little island and mast on the starboard side, with 3 funnels that could, much like USS Ranger, be pivoted up or down. Those funnels were attached to a power plant of 30,000 shaft horsepower, provided by 8 boilers, 4 coal and 4 oil fired, which could push the ship to around 26 knots through 2 shafts. To protect all of this, Hōshō carried 4 single 15-centimeter, 5.5-inch guns. Those were single-purpose weapons to protect from torpedo boats. Anti-aircraft defense was a pair of 8-centimeter, 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. That would be heavily reinforced later on with the usual swarm of 25mm guns. As for the air group, this was designed to be 15 aircraft, split between 2 hangars, a small forward hangar for fighters and a larger aft one for bombers. Not exactly a lot, but considering the small size, actually a bit impressive. That said, it wraps up the design features for the moment. Now let's move to the service history. Oh, right, before I forget, some sources will also note a sister or near sister to be named Shokaku, with that ship canceled by the Washington Treaty in 1922. Right, now for the service history, which would prove to be surprisingly long as it would turn out. As noted, the ship was commissioned on December 27, 1922. Although it wasn't until February 22, 1923, that the first pilots landed aboard the carrier. And those were British pilots brought over to Japan to help train Japanese aviators. That would be short-lived, and the Japanese pilots took over soon enough. However, those same pilots would prove a bit of an issue in keeping Hōshō sailing around. The Japanese aviators spent about a year flying off her deck before pushing through modifications. Hōshō, as I said earlier, was initially completed with a small island. Her pilots would, in a story familiar to anyone who studied naval aviation, they took up the war on island superstructures common to other navies. They thought it obscured vision and obstructed the flight deck, with a side of this particular island being small and cramped, which in absolute fairness it was. So everything above the flight deck was removed from June 6th to August 20th, 1924, leaving Hōshō with the flush deck design she'd retained for the next 20 years. Hōshō returned to service in this new guise, lacking an island and with a modified flight deck to further improve flight operation. With those operations, now controlled from a platform on the side of the flight deck. In this guise, Hōshō would serve with the Japanese fleet, in the process of which she proved quite useful for developing carrier operations. As Japan's first carrier, Hōshō would provide useful insight, with this work continuing through the rest of the 1920s and into the early 1930s. Hōshō was a very useful training ship, but even at this point, she was clearly not a combat warship. Not if better options, like Akagi or Kaga, were available. A similar situation to USS Langley or HMS Hermes in this respect. That said, Hōshō would actually see combat duty. As the 1920s shifted into the 1930s, the Japanese army began to poke China, with Hōshō joining the fray in the Shanghai incident of 1932. This kicked off on January 28th, hence the alternate name of January 28th incident. It would, however, last until March 3rd, during which Hōshō and Kaga were called in for reinforcements in February, with Hōshō in particular seeing combat on February 5th, 1932. Well, her aircraft saw combat anyway. At the time, her air wing was 15 aircraft. These planes would see the first aerial combat for the Imperial Japanese Navy, when 3 of her fighters, escorting 2 bombers, were jumped by 9 Chinese fighters. Of the 14 aircraft involved, only 1 Chinese fighter was damaged. Still, this was the start of the Japanese Navy's famous aircraft carrier usage. Over the rest of February 1932, Hōshō's aircraft, and Kaga's, it must be noted, continued to fly support missions, with a particularly noteworthy one on February 26th. 6 Hōshō fighters would down 2 out of 5 Chinese fighters that attacked Kaga's bombers. In any case, when the battle ended in March, Hōshō returned to Japan, where she would remain through 1935 on training duty. Not much of note would occur in this period, with one exception: the 4th Fleet incident on September 25th, 1935. I've covered this several times at this point, but the short version: the Japanese Navy set sail on a large fleet exercise, only to pull a Halsey and sail right into a major typhoon. Quite a few ships suffered damage during this. Hōshō, in particular, had her forward flight deck collapse. That had to be cut away before repair work could begin. And the worst thing is, this was minor damage compared to some of the other ships, as you can see here. Regardless, Hōshō would be in dock from November 22nd, 1935 to March 31st, 1936, during which the ship had her flight deck support strengthened while the previously rotating funnels were fixed in position. The horizontal position angled slightly down to keep smoke from the deck. Other strengthening measures were made across the ship to prevent a repeat of the 4th Fleet incident. Once Hōshō returned to service in summer 1936, she initially started training duty. But this wouldn't last long before she returned to combat against China. In July 1937, Hōshō joined Kaga and Ryūzhō as part of the 3rd Fleet. The carrier sailed to China on July 11th, 1937, with Hōshō's air wing starting combat operations on July 16th. Details on those operations are sparse, beyond the fact they ran from July through October of 1937. That said, there were some notable incidents, with combined fleet citing 3 of her fighters downing a Chinese Martin B-10 on July 25th. And then on September 21st, when aircraft from Hōshō joined their comrades from Ryūshō. 6 fighters from Hōshō escorted friendly bombers. They would engage 9 Chinese aircraft, 7 Curtiss Hawk III fighters, and 2 scouts. The Japanese pilots claimed 6 planes down, according to Combined Fleet. Other sources claim only 2 shot down. Either way, the only Japanese losses were 5 fighters that ran out of fuel before returning to the ship. The pilots were rescued, but the planes were a lost cause. Still, once replacements arrived, Hōshō would continue to support operations for the rest of the month, before departing China entirely on October 17, 1937. For the rest of the 1930s, Hōshō would be kept close to home, either on training or in refit, because by this point, she was clearly no longer fit for intensive combat. The carrier struggled to operate modern aircraft. She was simply too small. Even after work to enlarge the elevators, that was a patch job because Hōshō was fundamentally an outdated ship. So she was officially reassigned to training work in August 1939, with another report in December 1940 making it very clear she couldn't operate modern aircraft like the Zero or Val. Now bear all of this in mind when I say this. The Japanese would still use Hōshō on light combat duty at the start of the Pacific War, despite the aging air group and the previously established reports. Hōshō was assigned to the main body of the Japanese fleet in September 1941, operating a surprisingly large air wing of 11 A-5M fighters and 8 B-4Y torpedo bombers. Those planes and their carrier joined the main body on December 7, 1941, and setting sail to provide distant support for the Pearl Harbor strike. Hōshō joined Zuiho in covering the Japanese battleships when they sailed into the Pacific, to protect them from submarine attack should that be necessary. On December 10th, an apparent submarine was spotted stalking the ships. Hōshō sent up aircraft to chase that sighting, even though it was after sunset. That required the ship to turn on her deck lights to recover the aircraft once they returned empty-handed. Moreover, Hōshō had to sail off on her own to recover those planes, leaving her and her escorting destroyers detached from the main fleet. If this weren't December 1941, that could have ended poorly. As it was, Hōshō was spotted by scouts on December 11th and rejoined the main body to return home, during which another apparent submarine was spotted and depth charged on December 12th. Once Hōshō was back in port after this excitement, she would spend her time close to home through May of 1942. The ship wasn't fit to serve in the South Pacific offensives, nor those in the Central Pacific. In fact, she wouldn't even attempt to sail after American forces until the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942. This came to nothing, of course, and Hōshō was back in dock on April 22nd to prepare for the Battle of Midway in early June 1942. Hōshō would set sail on May 29th once more with the battleships. She was not to join the Kido Butai, as the Japanese knew she wasn't fit for that. Covering against submarines was one thing. Engaging American ships was quite another. Because of this, Hōshō didn't see combat. Instead, she would use her aircraft for finding other Japanese ships. such as the destroyer Izanami, which got lost in fog on June 3rd, or the discovery of the battered Hiryu on June 5th, 1942. The famous pictures of her smoldering wreck were taken by B4Ys from Hōshō, being honestly her most famous use during the Second World War, which is saying something, I suppose. In any event, after the Japanese withdrew, Hosho returned home on June 14th. She would be permanently assigned to training duty for the rest of the war, from 1942 through 1945. She never sailed far from home, with the most noteworthy event being a refit from March 27th to April 26th, 1944. That extended the flight deck by 6 meters over the bow and stern, to bring it to 180.8 meters, 593 feet in all, to land newer Japanese aircraft. Not operate them, but at least land them for training. Combined Fleet notes this taking place in June. After this, the ship remained at home, with Hosho attacked by American air raids on March 19, 1945. 7 aircraft struck the ship, landing 3 bomb hits on the aft flight deck. Those were, however, small weapons, and the damage was minor. Hosho was repaired easily enough. However, she would eventually be confined to dock by July 1945, possibly taking a rocket hit on July 24th. That being said, she was not sunk like so many other ships. Hosho would survive the war. Japan's oldest carrier would be one of the last, ultimately ending out her life on repatriation duty, bringing Japanese soldiers home, before being scrapped in August 1946. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.